member for 39 years, so, and never have been more proud than today because of the support that the National Press Club and its nonprofit arm, the National Press Club Journalism Institute, provided in this case. 6 years ago, Emilio Gutierrez was here at the National Press Club as an honored guest to accept the Fourth Estate Award, the John Aubuchon Press Freedom Award on behalf of the journalists of Mexico, who were then and still are under tremendous duress. And we at the National Press Club wanted to recognize that. And we chose Emilio as our speaker. And he gave a wonderful speech with my colleague Michelle Salcedo translating. And about 6 weeks later, Emilio, who had a pending asylum case, went to a regular check-in at El Paso, and he was detained, and there was an effort made to deport him. And I was doing some work for the National Press Club and got that call, and that began a very long odyssey that involved many, many people in this room, many, many journalists, many, many lawyers, and last night Emilio was back at the Fourth Estate dinner, and we were able to announce that 6 years later, and for him 15 years after he legally entered the United States and requested asylum, he has been declared eligible for asylum.
Here, here.
So it took a lot of work, but again, I think, Emilio in many ways was the canary down the mine shaft, because since Emilio came to the United States, we have seen many more democracies begin to backslide, and many of our colleagues from other countries have had to flee their homes. Some of them are here today. And so we want to use this case as a springboard to talk about what we can do to help our colleagues and to also help advance the cause of democracy worldwide. And I think this is a problem for all of us that we really need to work on. And so I want to have this discussion. And for those of you, there are cards at the seats if you have questions or even comments, because I know many of you, there are people here, I see the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and they've been stalwarts in this case. Many of you probably have things you would like to say to add to the discussion. So whether it's a question or a comment, just hold your card up, and Cecily in the back will come collect them, and we will have to do it this way because we're mic'd and you're not, and we want to have this broadcast and also saved and archived so people can refer to this later. So that's why we're doing it that way. So I'm going to turn to Michelle, who really was at the very beginning of the Press Club involvement with Emilio's case, and have you talk a little bit about how that came to be.
Thank you, Kathy, and thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon. I'm Michelle Salcedo. I'm the former membership secretary here at the club, but my introduction to Emilio was when I was national president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. And early in 2011, I attended a conference in El Paso at the University of El Paso that was sponsored by ASNI and I believe APME at the time. They've since merged, but at the time they were separate organizations. And they were very concerned about the level of violence that Mexican journalists were facing. And there were 3 journalists that they brought that were in El Paso at the time. Emilio was one of them, and the other 2 were Alejandro Hernandez and Ricardo Chavez. All 3 had fled, not at the same time, but all 3 had fled independently because of threats from either police or the military. And they told us their absolutely chilling stories of what they had gone through and why they were applying for asylum. That was in 2011. Later that year, NAHJ had its national convention, and every year the president is allowed to present an award to anyone they like. And so I thought it was very, very important to highlight what was going on with our colleagues in Mexico. And so I presented the President's Award that year to Emilio and to Alejandro and Ricardo to raise their profile and to raise interest and to raise the profile of these cases and what was going on in Mexico to our colleagues there. And it worked to a certain extent. AP picked up the story. CPJ very generously, Ricardo Sandoval Palos at the time was in charge of the Americas for CPJ and came to a hearing on behalf of Emilio to talk about conditions in Mexico. And as I was preparing for today and going back through some emails and through some clips, I was astounded to see that back in 2011 and 2012, the immigration courts were raising the very same questions that Judge Howe was raising in 2017.
And we should interrupt to say Judge Howe was the judge who initially denied Emilio asylum, questioning first whether he was a journalist, and secondly, whether saying, well, they have this program in Mexico to keep journalists safe. Of course you'll be safe. And I think all of us in this room know how ridiculous that is. So keep going.
So those questions kept surfacing, even though they were continuously answered and evidence provided for Emilio's bona fides as a journalist in Chihuahua, for the dangers that Mexican journalists faced. And at the same time, I think there were Emilio and the other two Mexican journalists that I had given the President's Award to continued to fight for asylum. Prior to those applications, there had only been one Mexican journalist who had received asylum, and he was the editor of lapolaca.com out of Ciudad Juarez. And before that, there were zero. And what I didn't realize at the time, and have since learned, is that the asylum grant rate for Mexicans in general is 4%. It's one of the lowest in the world for U.S. countries, for people who apply, people in general, not even including journalists, one of the lowest in the world. The highest grant rate goes to Belarus at 75%, and then it obviously tapers off from there, and that was the case then, and that continues to be the case. So 2 months after we presented the President's Award to Emilio and Alejandro and Ricardo, Alejandro received asylum. And 4 years after that, Ricardo received asylum. And there was another journalist who applied for asylum in Canada, and he received asylum. And in the meantime, Emilio is not only waiting, but trying to earn a living and trying to, and complying with everything, complying with his immigration dates, complying with what the attorneys are asking of him, what the courts are asking of him, no arrests, a model citizen, waiting for a decision from the courts. And finally, it looks like he's run out of appeals and briefs to file, and the legal path is going directly to the Judge Howe's courtroom. And he and I had a conversation, and he said, I'm really kind of afraid that they're gonna pick me up. They're not gonna even listen to my case. And so that's when I went to John Donnelly, who at the time was the head of the Press Freedom Committee here at the Press Club. And I buttonholed him literally at a party and said, I really need to talk to you because this is imminent. And I explained to him Emilio's case, and he was on his way into a meeting of the Press Freedom Committee. And he presented Emilio's case to the committee, and he came out a few hours later and said, we're going to present him with the Abishan Award on behalf of the National Press Club, which was more than I could have ever dreamed. Not only elevating Emilio's case that much higher and putting more pressure on Judge Howe to do the right thing, but bringing in one of the most talented group of people and tremendous resources, without which I'm convinced that Emilio would not be here today. So thank you to Kathy, who filed 1 billion FOIA requests, and as a result of those requests, was able to put pressure on the immigration judge and on ICE to release Emilio, who by then was in detention, to release Emilio from detention, to Lynette, who very generously moved all the pieces into place to offer Emilio a Knight Wallace fellowship, to Penny, who filed the appeals that ultimately were successful, and to Eduardo, who has been on this case almost from the beginning, has been relentless, has worked pro bono, has followed all of its twists and turns. And to Emilio, who has shown such grace under such tremendous stress. He's one of my role models to be, when I think about some adversity that pops up, it is nothing compared to what he has been through in order to arrive at this day. So thank you to everybody. That's a little bit of the backstory on how we got here.
Thank you, Michelle. So I will just fill in a few blanks that after Emilio won the Aubuchon Award and went back, he was, as we said, there was an effort made to deport him, and Ed Beckett, who is on the screen here from El Paso, will talk a little bit about that. And then as a result of that, he was detained. So Emilio has lost 2 homes because of his journalism. First, when he had to flee Mexico under threat of death after reporting on corruption by the military there. And then secondly, when the US government detained him, and he lost his home in Las Cruces, New Mexico, where, as Michelle said, he had been living as a perfectly law-abiding resident. So this is somebody who's sacrificed a lot for our profession. What happened after he was detained, we at the National Press Club tried really hard to explain to the Department of Homeland Security that they had made a mistake. When it was clear to us that they didn't make a mistake, that this was intentional, we filed a Freedom of Information Act request for all of the communications involving Emilio, because we felt that they would show, and they did, that there was a considerable amount of prejudice in this case. And that helped. But one of the most amazing things about this for me is, and heartening things with all the dark things that are happening in this world, is all the good people who came together for this case. And many of them are here in this room. Some of them are not. Bill McCarran, who was the executive director of the Press Club, recently retired, went himself to El Paso to visit Emilio and to meet Eduardo. He was helped by, we had a number of members of Congress help us. Lynette can talk about her members of Congress in Michigan. We had a number of members of Congress from New Mexico and Texas. And one of them I will call out specifically was Beto O'Rourke, who was the congressman from El Paso. I covered politics for a long time, and he was running for Senate in Texas, and he stood up for a Mexican journalist. That is not an easy thing to do. So I would say kudos especially to him. And then the other person who is not here today, but who I really feel in this room, is Julie Hsu, who was the longtime executive director of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. And when we were trying to prove that Emilio was indeed a journalist, despite all of Judge Howell's questions, we were talking to a number of people in this room about signing friend of the court briefs, and many of you did. And Lynette, who runs the Knight Wallace Journalism Fellowships, a very prestigious fellowship at the University of Michigan, said, not only do I want to sign the friend of the court brief, but I also would like to offer Emilio a fellowship. And Julie and I were sitting in the same room, and we started to cry. So I feel that today. So I want to maybe turn next to Ed, who's just in from another court case in El Paso, and who can pick up with a little bit about the story of what happened that day when you went with Emilio to the immigration office.
Yes, this, I believe it was December of 2018. So he had a check-in, and usually never go with the clients. We thought that maybe we should go with Emilio so he wouldn't go alone, and to go talk to ICE directly. And I know there was a pending motion with the court, like a motion to reopen his case. I believe that Judge Howe had denied it the same day that it was filed, and we didn't even know about it. So, so we go down there, and we had filed an emergency stay of removal so they wouldn't deport him, and it was pending too with the Board of Immigration Appeals there in Fairfax, Virginia. And so we get there and we check in, and I believe that day it was snowing. Actually, it was snowing. It rarely snows over here, but that day it was snowing. It was slippery. So Emilio was running a little bit late. So I called ICE. I said, "Hey, it's a snowstorm. It's icy, but he's on his way." They're like, "All right, it's okay. We understand." So we get there and everything seems normal, but then ICE tells Emilio to stand up, and then he tells him turn around, puts handcuffs on him, and and right in front of me. And it's like, well, what do I do as an attorney, right? They're arresting my client. He's not even committing a crime. So I'm like, why are you putting handcuffs on him? It's like, well, he's done. We're taking him. So where are you going to take him? I said, I have a pending motion in the court. And they're like, well, as far as we're concerned, he lost his case, and we're taking him back to Mexico. And I was in shock, and I was like, what do I do, right? Because I never had that situation where they're deporting someone in front of my face. And here on the border, I mean, literally, 20 minutes from my office, the border's right there. You'll be in Mexico. So it was like, wow, this is crazy. So I called the Board of Immigration Appeals on the phone, and I said, look, I'm right here. My client's in handcuffs. You guys have not adjudicated my stay, my motion. They're literally going to take this guy. They're going to take him to Mexico. What can I, they're like, well, sir, hold on. They shouldn't do that. Well, they're doing it. I said, like, they're doing it. So it was a clerk, right? I was talking to a clerk, and she's like, well, let me talk to a judge, and I'll get back to you. And I'm like, what? You're going to get paid? Yeah. Like, I'll wait. Give me 15 minutes. So I tell ICE, can you not take him? And they're like, no, it's too late, sir. It's too late. We're taking him. It's our job. And they call me back, and they say, sir, we talked to the judge. He looked at the case. The stay's been granted. And I'm like, oh, but by that time he was already in a van, him and the son, they're crying and stuff. And so then I tell ICE, I said, hey, I just got the clerk is saying that the stay was granted. You got to bring him back. And they said, well, we'll see what we can do. There's no guarantee. He might already be in Mexico. But they brought him back, and then they detained him. And then that's when the nightmare started. Yeah. But that was my experience to the best of my recollection from 2018 December.
2017. 2017.
Oh, 17. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. And Emilio was held for 9 months. He had not committed any crime. And during that 9 months, we worked to mobilize support for his case. And Lynette, I'm going to let you talk because you went to El Paso and saw Emilio in detention and offered him the fellowship. So
I did. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Eddie. It's great to see you. The last time you and I had an exchange, it was you sharing the news of the BIA outcome, and so hopefully we'll get to talk about that moment too. But I think I want to start, Kathy, by usually I'm relentlessly optimistic, but I think I will be the wet blanket in this room because for those of you who are interested in writing about this, I just sort of want to make sure we're talking about these very traumatic events. And we started by you saying that we're here to celebrate. And I actually am a little bit allergic to that word in this context because I think we're at a conclusion, but we're not at a point of celebration because all of the systems that made this possible to happen to Emilio are still in place. And so for any of the journalists who are here to write about this, it's really important that any stories that come out of this should not emphasize, hooray, this is a win. I don't think it's a win. I think it is simply a conclusion to 15 years of injustice. And there's nothing about the injustice. There are no causes that have been changed. And so I think that, you know, we have to really be focused on systemic change. I know that when I turn it over to Penny, we're going to start talking about recommendations. But the program that I run, the Knight Wallace Fellowships at the University of Michigan, many of you are familiar with. We offer academic year fellowships to journalists from around the world every year. And it just so happened that day that Julie and Kathy were working to rally support, we were in the midst of our application process for the next year's fellowship. And so I was able to respond with more than just a signature and to figure out a way for us to bring Emilio to the university. It was an unusual case, for sure. Usually journalists who are coming to our program are applying themselves because the fellowship is something that they've been aware of for a long time in their career. They have a project that they want to pursue, and this is a part of its professional development. And this was a situation where somebody was sitting in detention in El Paso, not knowing actually that these conversations were even happening. And so we decided that we were going to make this happen. And I say it that way because I think the people who have come together to try to address the injustice here, none of our systems were really built to be responsive to the level of threat journalists are under today. We are supposed to, at universities for these fellowships, when we bring international journalists, there's a process for applying for a J1 visa, which is the mechanism we have at our disposal to bring international journalists to universities at Scholars. This is what they use at Harvard and Stanford and Columbia and MIT and any place that has these. We're actually not set up to do this. And so to make a commitment to figure this out, you basically, I mean, in my case, I had to call the general counsel's office and say, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to a detention center in El Paso, and we've got to figure out a way to do this. And when I met with Emilio, it was the first time we met, and we were behind two-way glass in the detention center with guards watching us all around. And I introduced myself, saying I'm from something called the Knight Wallace Fellowship at the University of Michigan, and we'd like to offer you something that we hope you're out of detention to accept. And that was the first time he learned about the fellowship. And, you know, the legal process around this, when we say that Kathy had filed 1 million or 1 billion FOIA requests, maybe we're underestimating the number of FOIAs, and there were so many lawyers involved. I see colleagues from the Reporters Committee here. I don't know if people from Ballard Spahr are here, but there were so many lawyers involved in this. And the only reason Emilio was able to come and accept the fellowship, which was to start that September, for the start of the academic year, is because one of the lawsuits had moved forward and the judge had ordered for evidence to be turned over, evidence that we believed would have shown that that arrest that Ed just talked about in December of 2017 was a retaliatory arrest because of comments that Emilio made that were critical of the Trump administration when he accepted the Aubuchon. That's what we believe the chain of events was that led up to that arrest, and that somewhere in the emails there was evidence to show that. And there was a habeas case filed.
Which is Penny's case.
Which is what Penny's going to talk about. And on July 26th, I think that was the 26th, 2018. I mean, this has been going on for so long, you can see that we all have to, like, was it 2018? Was it 2017? We got a call that they had been released. And the Texas Tribune, which had been really on top of covering Emilio's case, and a great reporter who was then there at the time, Julian Aguilar, I think was the first person to report that he and Oscar had been released. And they were able to come to the university. But I'll say before I turn it over to Penny, this is one case that we're involved in, but unfortunately, it is not the only press freedom case that we're involved in. This year, we have a reporter from Haiti. We have 2 reporters from Hong Kong. Last year, we had a reporter from Kashmir. And our programs were all designed for people to come for one academic year and then go back to their job and go back to their country. And what do you do when that's not possible?
Yeah.
And what do you do when the United States is the country that has made it much more dangerous for journalists in other places? And I think Kathy's point that Emilio was victimized twice, once in Mexico and once in the United States, is another thing that makes his case particularly devastating. And so, again, I will say this is a well-deserved and just resolution.
But it took too long.
But it took too long, and we actually have to change the systems. Canada has been much better about this than the United States. There is a way to develop policy that would allow special visa processes for journalists who are at risk. We don't have them here. And we certainly know that there's an arbitrary nature. Michelle pointed out the very, very low rate for Mexican journalists. We also know that it's completely arbitrary, depending on what country you come from, depending on what shade of brown you are when you come to the United States, and we just have to address all of it.
Yeah, and depending on what port of entry you come
And
through,
what
too.
point of entry.
So El Paso, where, so Emilio was also a victim of geography. El Paso has the worst admission rate.
And the judge that Emilio got, Judge Howe, had a 99.2% denial rate.
Yeah, this is according to TRAC, the Syracuse
That
tracker. Yeah.
He never stood a chance, and it all arbitrary.
And so I will just say that the reason, there were many lawyers. One person I forgot to call out, Chuck Tobin, who is from Ballard Spahr, who is the lawyer for the National Press Club, was very involved in this case, and a number of his colleagues were very involved in his case. But we had appeals, so there were immigration appeals going forward to try to get Emilio's asylum case back on track and to overcome these denials. But at the same time, he was detained. And so we finally filed a habeas corpus case, and that was filed. That is where we get to Penny, who leads the Rutgers University Law School's Human Rights Law Clinic. And Penny and her students were the ones that filed the habeas case that made it possible for Emilio to go to the University of Michigan. So Thank you, Penny. And why don't you talk a little bit about your role and what you learned? Because I know Penny has recommendations.
Can I just say, just so people understand when we talk about the people who have spent so much time on it, today is the first time Penny and I have met each other in person.
Same.
And we have spent years and hours and hours and hours together. And when she walked in today, I was like, oh my gosh, we've never been in the same room together.
I
So
know.
yeah.
Anyway, I can't tell you how happy and excited I am to be here. I can't tell you how amazing it was to work with everybody who Kathy mentioned, and especially Emilio, because he really has handled this incredibly traumatic event with really just, such grace, and has, has risen above all the, discrimination, abuse, retaliatory actions. So, Emilio has been our inspiration, certainly my inspiration. It's been a great pleasure to work with Ed Beckett, fellow lawyer. So let me tell you, I want to put this a little bit into context, just so that you understand this whole issue of detention and what habeas corpus is, because you may not know. In 1996, when Bill Clinton was president, and he, sort of wanted to really, sort of stay in the middle, appease, the right wing, while also sort of showing, sort of more progressive people that he was still one of them. A really terrible law was signed. It was called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act, or IRA, which is, easier to remember. And that really completely transformed our immigration system. And as a result, it increased, since its passage, the number of immigrants detained, and the average detention length have increased exponentially. So today, in 2023, more than 35,000 people are in immigration detention. That is a lot of people. And some people are placed in detention indefinitely for years as they wait, and they wait, and they wait, and then they wait even more for the backlogged immigration system to process their cases. Detention conditions are punitive by definition. Even though immigration detention is supposed to be administrative, it actually is punitive, as Lynette, described. You talk to people who have not committed crimes through, plastic walls, and they're in brick buildings with bars on the doors. And most people are held in remote places away from lawyers, their families. Emilio was part of the system. And, after living in Las Cruces for over a decade, where he was an integral part of the community, as you heard, he was arrested for making remarks in this very building while receiving an incredibly prestigious award. So if he's not safe, really nobody is. Ed described, stopping the deportation, it's, really it's like made for a movie. Those effects are made for a movie, very dramatic. The call coming in at the last minute, rushing, to catch the van before it crosses the border. But nobody, rode into the sunset, for like a wonderful experience, because Emilio was detained. When somebody is detained in the United States, there is a mechanism within the Constitution that allows you to challenge the detention if the Constitution was violated. And that is called a writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, also referred to, quote unquote, as the Great Writ, is guaranteed by Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution. Really think about that. It's such an important part of our legal system that it's in the first section of the U.S. Constitution. The writ dates back to the 15th century, and habeas corpus literally means you shall have the body. So it's really a check on the executive by a court that says, you have the body, show me the body so that I can make a determination whether or not this person is being detained illegally. So, when a court considers a petition for habeas corpus, it's not really considering like the person's guilt or innocence, or even Emilio's asylum case, right? It's considering whether or not the nature of the detention itself violates the Constitution. So, since the Constitution was enacted in the 18th century, the writ of habeas corpus has only been suspended twice. The first time was during the Civil War, for obvious reasons, and then the second time was by President George W. Bush in 2006 in response to the 9/11 attacks, and it was suspended only for a certain class of people, those people who are deemed enemy combatants. They could not challenge the constitutionality of their actual detention. So Emilio is in jail, and the only way that we could have gotten him out of detention, and this had nothing to do with the merits of his asylum claim, is to show that he was thrown into detention for unconstitutional reasons. So we developed a lawsuit based on saying that he was thrown into detention because it was a violation of his First Amendment rights and his 14th Amendment rights. And I'll talk about those in a second. But again, I told you how important this writ is in our history, not just for a history lesson, but to just show the audacity that the government exhibited, because we filed this writ of habeas corpus. It's been around for 250 years, and the federal government said that Emilio does not have the right to question the constitutionality of his detention, that the writ of habeas corpus does not apply to people who are detained in the immigration process, which is totally absurd, right? And, I teach constitutional law, so I know it's totally absurd. So when we got the papers that said he can't even file this motion, I laughed, right? I teach this stuff. So, but the thing is, and they put this in the papers challenging our motion, and they put it in everything, right? It's like cut and paste from whatever their database is. But it really is an intimidation tactic for lawyers, because some lawyers would get this, this response from the government, oh, you can't even file this, it doesn't apply to immigration, and they would freak out, right? They would be like, oh my God, I don't know how to research this, I'm an immigration lawyer, I don't know what to do. So it really is an intimidation tactic, and I also think it's a tactic to it's like throwing spaghetti at a wall. Hopefully they'll get one judge who will, who won't do the homework or who is biased against immigrants, who said, yeah, you can't even raise this in the context of someone who has, who's an immigrant. Luckily, we didn't have a judge like that. He immediately said that, yes, I can at least hear your case. Doesn't mean you're going to win, but I will at least hear your First Amendment claims and your 14th Amendment claims. So our 14th Amendment claims we lost on, right? But we argued that given President Trump's vitriolic statements and hate of Mexico and Mexicans, that gave us enough strength to say that Emilio was targeted for detention and deportation because he was Mexican, and all of these billions of emails that Kathy got from the government were really helpful, because what we found, or Kathy found through her just sheer will to get Emilio some help, was that literally President Trump took office in January 2017, that literally in January 17, like a week after he takes office, all of a sudden there's a lot of traffic between sort of in ICE and the immigration system. And the people that they had, and they made a list in El Paso of the people who should be immediately detained and deported. And every single person on that list had a Hispanic last name. There was nobody named Smith. There was nobody named, Jones. There was nobody named, Venetis, and my family is Greek. There was no Greek person on the list. Every single person had a Hispanic last name. And there was, Emilio and Oscar were on that list. So we thought, at least from the 14th Amendment perspective, we had proof that that Latinos were being targeted, and that we had all this very incendiary language from the President of the United States, who makes policy. We lost on that. The judge said, well, something, because of a Supreme Court case actually that had been decided just weeks before, where the Supreme Court said, just because somebody says something while they're running for president, it doesn't mean that that's governmental policy. And yeah, he may have hated all Latinos, but he didn't specifically hate Mexicans. It really is, I think that the judge didn't scrutinize that part of our argument, because he really gave us the moon when we raised our First Amendment claims. And again, these emails were really, really helpful, and also, the involvement of members of the press club, who filed affidavits, who talked about his receiving the award, who talked about him being Knight Wallace Fellow. All of those things were incredibly helpful. And I'm going to read to you from the judge's opinion. This is a judge in Texas who's writing this. And I want to read the judge's own words because they really are quite beautiful. And everybody who is a journalist or celebrates freedom of the press, should really, bask in the words of the court. So here is what the judge says I'm just going to read excerpts because I really can't say it better than what is said in the opinion. So here's the freedom of the press claim. And, obviously we said he was targeted because he is a journalist and he made these comments while receiving an award at the National Press Club. And he was targeted because he was critical of the U.S. government. And let me just tell you Emilio's comments. They were pretty innocuous. He said, our immigration system is broken and it needs to be fixed, right? He was not telling people to riot. He was not telling, he said something that every person in this room probably has said, that every person in this country has probably uttered, regardless of what their political background is, that we really do need to fix our immigration system. That is what landed Emilio in jail. So let me read what the excerpts of what the court says. And this is a federal judge in Texas in 2018 when we got Emilio released. So this is how it starts. Freedom of the press is a fundamental personal right which is not confined to newspapers and periodicals, right? So the judge is saying this is a very, very broad freedom. One of the major purposes of the First Amendment is to protect the free discussion of governmental affairs. So he's saying speech is really protected. So then he says, this of course includes discussions of candidates, structures, and form of government, the manner in which the government is operated or should be operated, and all such matters relating to the political process. The Constitution specifically selected the press to play an important role in the discussion of public affairs. Consequently, the press serves as a powerful antidote to any abuses of power by governmental officials, and as a constitutionally chosen means for keeping officials elected by the people responsible to all the people whom they were selected to serve. Then he goes on and says the First Amendment, quote, must be taken as a command of the broadest scope that explicit language, read in the context of a liberty-loving society, will allow. So he gives this really great foundation about the First Amendment, and then he applies it to Emilio's facts. So it says, the foundation of petitioners, that's us, freedom of the press claim is built upon the emails between ICE officials, which Kathy got, the temporal proximity between Mr. Gutierrez Soto's criticism of ICE and the revocation of petitioner's parole, and the comments from an ICE official directly to Bill McCarran of the Press Club. I'll continue. The emails between ICE officials undermine the government's argument. The emails show that ICE officials were already targeting Mr. Gutierrez Soto in February 2017. This is significant because it is before the immigration judge issued the removal order in July 2017. Moreover, Mr. Gutierrez Soto criticized ICE and the government in a very public manner while accepting a prestigious award from the National Press Club. His arrest occurred only a couple of months later. So let me read further, where the court says, taking all of this evidence into account, petitioners us have offered enough evidence to create a genuine issue of fact regarding whether respondents violated Emilio's First Amendment rights. Petitioners have offered evidence that allow for an inference that they were targeted before their asylum case was denied. Let's see. The government retaliated against them for asserting their free press rights. This is sufficient evidence to conclude that the government's reason for detaining Emilio Gutierrez Soto is a pretext. So you have a federal judge in Texas basically saying, we have shown enough evidence to show that Emilio was detained in a retaliatory fashion because he made comments critical of the government. Again, this is pretty unusual for a federal judge in Texas. The judge could have stopped there, but he didn't. Actually, we won, like I said, we won the moon. He then says that not only did Emilio win his First Amendment claim on freedom of the press grounds, but also on just plain old First Amendment grounds. And I had done some work. I think that's how Kathy ultimately found me, because I had represented another person who was detained on First Amendment grounds, who was a much more vocal activist. And I think that's how Kathy heard about me and found me. But anyway, let me just read again from the opinion where the court says, drawing on all reasonable inferences in favor of petitioners, the evidence could establish that the government retaliated against immigrant activists who criticized the government's policy. For example, ICE officials' comment towards Bill McCarran could be taken as evidence that ICE disapproves of negative publicity. When that is taken in conjunction with ICE's alleged pattern of targeting other immigration activists after they spoke out, and Mr. Gutierrez Soto being detained shortly after he spoke out, there is enough evidence to create an issue of material fact regarding whether the government retaliated against Emilio Gutierrez Soto for his comments. So again, it really was a huge victory on First Amendment grounds, where the court took the evidence that had been gathered and really took to heart all these documents that we had filed, including Bill McCarran's information, and also that he had been accepted into the Knight Wallace Foundation. And the judge found that indeed the government acted in a retaliatory fashion for Emilio's exercising, his most, fundamental right to speech and most fundamental right for speech as a journalist. So that's, ultimately Emilio came out of jail, and that was a big, big, big victory. But, it really did not end there. It went further, and, I don't know if, if Ed wants to talk about the, even further proceedings he was out of jail, but then his immigration case was still pending. So I'm going to turn it back to Kathy, and or Ed, and I'll talk about my recommendations for reform in a little while.
I want to just give, before anybody else up here gets a chance to speak, I want to give Emilio a chance to say a few words if he wants to. I will say this. I think you have all heard how much pressure has been put on this journalist. And we thought about whether or not to do this event today, because Emilio still hasn't gotten his asylum papers. He has been told he is going to get them in March 18th, right? March 18th. And we will be there. And in the back of the room is Katie Townsend from the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press is still pressing our lawsuit to get the communications. And why? Because Emilio still does not have his asylum. I want to emphasize how much taxpayer resources have been wasted on what should have been a slam dunk asylum claim made legally. And I would just say to those policymakers who might ever be listening, if you want secure borders, help people stay in their own countries. If you want to help people stay in their own countries, help stamp out the corruption that is sending them here. If you want to help stamp out corruption, help journalists. Because journalists are the check on corruption, and that is exactly the reporting that Emilio was doing when he was forced to come here. And if journalists know that there is no exit, that there is no help in the home of the free, the brave, and the First Amendment, they're going to be discouraged from doing the important work that they do. So Emilio may not want to say much because we don't have those papers yet, and his lawyer's right here to tell him if he's saying too much, but Emilio.
Muchas gracias. Me resulta más fácil hablar en español y creo que Michelle me va a auxiliar.
So thank you very much. It's easier for me to speak in Spanish.
Creo que ya prácticamente mis compañeras lo han descrito la trayectoria profesional en México mía.
My colleagues here have described my professional trajectory in Mexico.
Y estos 15 años macabros, terribles.
And these 15 years have been quite difficult, have been terrible.
Creo que debo ser prudente con con mis palabras porque este proceso todavía no concluye.
I'm going to be careful with my words because the process still has not concluded.
No quisiera que me ocurriera lo mismo que después estuve aquí, que después de estar aquí regresé a la cárcel.
And I don't want to go back to jail.
Y en este caso, pues, lo que me queda es decirles que me siento profundamente agradecido
I feel profoundly grateful for
Con-
everyone here,
con mi abogado, Eddie Beckett,
for my attorney, Eddie Beckett,
que fue la persona que entró en la última instancia a auxiliarnos a mi hijo y a mí.
who was the person who helped me
Quien,
to finally help my son and I.
quien evitó que de regresar a México pudiéramos caer nuevamente en las garras del crimen organizado gubernamental.
Because he helped prevent us from falling into the hands once again of a criminal, a government that was in criminal hands.
Y lo que les quiero decir es que les agradezco mucho a ustedes, colegas, que han seguido el proceso tan largo. Incluso de los estudiantes de Penny, algunos ya están ejerciendo su labor como abogados. Empezaron como estudiantes y ahora son destacados abogados después de 15 años y 10. He perdido las fechas en donde han aportado su apoyo a este proceso que se convirtió en una causa.
There are many people that who, of course, helped me, not the least of which were Penny's students, her law students, who helped us file the appeal and did all the work that enabled us to file the appeal.
A Eddie, muchas gracias, Eddie.
Thank you very much, Eddie.
Al National Press Club, a Kathy,
To the
a
National
Bill,
Press Club and Kathy,
inmensamente agradecido.
hugely, hugely grateful.
Los amo mucho.
I love them very much.
A Michelle, que fue una pieza muy clave para seguir en este proceso.
To Michelle, who was a key person in this process.
Muchas gracias, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Michelle.
A Penny, que puso todo su empeño con sus estudiantes para llegar a este punto. Mil gracias.
To Penny, thank you very much for helping with all of her students so that we could arrive at this point.
A mi querida amiga Lynette,
To my dear friend Lynette,
muchas gracias, Lynette,
thank you very much, Lynette,
por ti. En cierta forma estoy aquí, en
For-
cierta forma tengo un aliciente de vida.
because of you, I have a license on life. I have a good life.
Muchas gracias. A
Thank you
ustedes,
very much.
a ustedes, colegas, con todo mi corazón, muchísimas, muchísimas, muchísimas gracias. De parte de mi hijo y de parte mía. Muy honrado me siento con ustedes.
For all the colleagues who are here today, thank you, thank you, thank you very much on behalf of me and my son.
Y muy pequeño ante el gran esfuerzo que han realizado en apoyo a esta causa.
Otra vez.
Y muchas gracias por el inmenso apoyo que nos han brindado para esta
And
causa.
thank you very much for the enormous help you've all been to get us to this point in this cause.
Estoy a sus órdenes
I'm at your service
con humildad y con mucho cariño. Gracias.
with much, my God, cariño, with much affection. Thank you. God.
Gracias.
Right?
Ustedes.
So as Lynette very eloquently pointed out, the systems that caused this difficulty are still in place. And there are journalists right now, more journalists than ever, from more countries than ever, who are unable to go back home. And we need to figure out a way to help them, just like we helped Emilio. And so I know, Penny, you've got, and I want to say, for lawyers like Ed, these are not rich lawyers. They're not making a lot of money. Taking these cases doesn't make you a lot of money. And so, so we need to come up with ways to support the journalists who need our support, and then to support the people who support the journalists. And so I know Penny has some recommendations. I want to let you talk about them, and then please, if any of you have questions or comments, let us know, and then we'll wrap it up.
Kathy, can I say something really quick?
Yes, go ahead, Ed.
Well, I was just really fast. I just want to second, that this was an amazing people to work with, And I do remember when Bill McCarran came and we set up a meeting through Beto O'Rourke. We met with high officials from ICE. And basically, Bill McCarran was almost Christmas and told them, why don't you release this guy? He's a good guy. He's got evidence. He's a journalist. I'm down here from Washington, D.C. And they basically told him that to tone it down. And also, I want to say that your emails, it literally showed that they were surveilling him and targeting him. But I just want to say that I think that it was an honor to work on this case, and all of you are amazing. I feel like this is a collective win. That's what I tell people. You don't win this in a vacuum. I really think that without the support from the press club, from you, from Lynette, from everybody, all the lawyers, it wouldn't have been possible. But it's a done deal. He won already, so I don't think Emilio has to worry. Yeah. It's a done deal. He just has to go in front of the judge, they check his background, and then it's a done. They can't take it away. It's a done deal. I just want to say that really quick, that it's, as a collective, thank you guys. It's been an honor, and I wish lawyers supported each other like the way you guys from the press do so. So thank you.
Thank you, and we will be in El Paso just to make sure. Yeah. Okay, we'll see you in El Paso.
We'll see
right.
you
Okay.
on the night of March 18th. Check with us, and hopefully we will be celebrating.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Penny, what are your recommendations?
Yeah, so I have recommendations, for journalists, and then I have systemic recommendations of how to advocate so that the system can change within the government. So this is the first set of recommendations that I propose. Emilio is the exception for all the reasons we discussed. We can't let what happened to Emilio happen to any other journalist. This case, as Kathy said, should never, ever have been denied in the first place. So if you really want to harness all the good feelings in this room and your power as journalists who have access to reach people and through various forms of the media, this is what I recommend: to be proactive, not reactive, right? It was a nightmare because we were reactive. So I'm recommending the follow for all of us to be proactive. Number one, start a legal task force of experts in the First Amendment who are willing to take on asylum cases of journalists. Have them ready. These experts should be all over the country, and so they know the systems, the various judges, immigration judges and federal judges in the system. They should have impeccable credentials, screen them, and create a database of their work and support them in any way that you can. Nurture them, sponsor conferences, get-togethers, anything to make them feel that they're a part of your community, that they're extensions of you, and that they're protecting this fundamental constitutional right. Number two, I mentioned already, develop a database of the work, but also a database of experts around the country who are friendly to journalists that you can reach out to. Keep it updated. This is a perfect job for law students like mine, journalism students, interns, right, to update to compile the database and to keep updating it with information so that you can actually access people quickly. Number three, publicize all cases. I think a big part of this was that it was constantly in the press, and as Ed just said and others have said, as the judge said, because we had an affidavit from from Bill McCarran that ICE told him basically to shut up because the press was making ICE look bad. Send court watchers to asylum hearings. I cannot tell you how important it was. I mean, we just gave you a snapshot of this long odyssey. I firmly believe that ultimately we won our, because we were all then involved in the immigration appeal, that I believe that we ultimately won the immigration appeal in part because we had statements from Lynette, from Kathy, from Bill, just talking about what a kangaroo court the immigration judge ran. I mean, Ed does this for a living. It is helpful to have watchers there who can say, this is what happened in the room, right? They don't have to offer legal conclusions. That's for the lawyers, like, Ed and me to take care of. But to just say, yeah, the judge just, held a hearing in a record that's, thousands of pages long in 10 minutes. The power went out. The judge wouldn't let the witnesses testify, right? You just need to, as journalists, you know that. You just need to document it, and those can be very supportive documents. Develop a team of experts that can file amicus brief in every single immigration case involving a journalist, right? Because as Kathy said, it wasn't just Ed and I who were, the main lawyers. There were other lawyers and other organizations that were filing, they're called friend of the court brief, to let the court know that these issues are important to freedom of the press, the First Amendment. And this, is another thing, is to, nurture these experts and then encourage them to become immigration judges so that they can be deciding these types of cases. Or students to become immigration judges. Better yet, encourage them to become federal appeals court judges, because ultimately those are the ones who decide the cases. But you need people who know these issues and who are, who understand the process and who are sympathetic to people who are being, threatened with assassination for practicing their craft, and also for letting the people know that the system is very, very corrupt. And the other thing is, so these are what journalists can do, but this is what I think needs to happen. Folks who support freedom of the press globally should advocate, I think these are governmental reforms that I think are important, that immigration judges be trained in specific subject areas so that they can process immigration cases faster. Emilio's case was pending for 15 years. It should not have been, it was a slam dunk case. Really, there should be a group of immigration judges that only handle cases related to journalists. And also, and start putting this team of experts together, who can actually advocate for these things now. Along the same lines, immigration judges should become specialists in human rights conditions in either specific countries or regional areas. It makes no sense that immigration judges are dealing with a gazillion topics, and they have one case that deals with China, and another case that deals with Russia, and another case, that deals with Mexico. It really does, does not. It is incredibly, incredibly inefficient. So advocate for specialists in particular areas of abuse, particularly when it comes to journalists, and also that immigration judges have some sort of expertise in the regions that they're, that they're dealing with. And again, I can't stress this enough. Finally, harness all of your energies and connections to put supporters of freedom of speech and freedom of the press and supporters of journalists internationally on the bench. I'm not just talking about immigration judges, I'm talking also about putting people like that on the Court of Appeals, because ultimately these cases all go to the Court of Appeals, and on the US Supreme Court. There's no reason that chemical companies should be the only entities that have friendly ears in the court system. It really should be defenders of the Constitution who should be elevated to those positions so that they can look at them honestly, and they can look at them with human rights and the Constitution in mind when they're deciding cases like Emilio's. So those are my recommendations. I really charge all of you to go out and together we can try and do these things.
I have to say, if you're going to spend like 150 hours on Zooms with somebody, you can see that Penny's a good, like it's like getting constitutional law classes all the time. To be on Zooms with Penny, so this is very cool.
And I will just say, one of the things that Penny touched on is advocacy, and I think we in the press are really terrible about advocating for ourselves. And one of the things, Lynette mentioned this. She and I both. I have right now an Afghan journalist is at the University of Missouri. a Kashmiri journalist who was in Lynette's program is now at the University of Missouri. Why? Because these are programs, as Lynette discussed, which really were developed to bring people in for a year or two, to get them training, send them out and work in U.S. newsrooms, and then go home and spread the gospel of the free press. The problem is that those emerging democracies are now backsliding. And if we send people back, we are sending them back to jail or worse. So we must, and there are people in this room who are in this situation. I'm looking at you, Juan. And we need to support our colleagues. And one of the ways we can support them is by advocating for what was mentioned here, a special visa for human rights workers and journalists. This is in place in Canada. They started with 250 and they've now doubled it to 500 special visas a year. And it gives people at least a 3-year runway so they know they have legal status, they can work. Most of these people, by the way, would like to go home someday. Absolutely. We just don't know when. And they want to go home and they would like to report on their own countries while they are here. And what better, I won't say the newsroom thing, what better way to respond to the bad guys than to enable the journalists to continue reporting on them here. So I think we need to really collectively as a profession begin to point out to policymakers how much you lose when you waste time, resources, and money on a case like Emilio's that should have been decided years ago, and how much we can gain if we enable the journalists to do their jobs.
And I just wanted to just second the point about having people in the courtroom, having people in these hearings. One of the things that the Judge Howe did in Emilio's case that led to the first appeal was he said that he doubted that Emilio was a journalist. And Ed, whose file was 1,000 pages, included over 100 stories with Emilio's byline on them. And when questioned about that in the appeal, the judge said, well, I don't read Spanish. And that was accepted as a valid response from a judge who was deciding what was going to happen with Emilio's life. And if we hadn't been there and assembled to respond to that, that would have stood. And so what we were able to do at the University of Michigan through our Language Resource Center, they created a weekend volunteer translate-a-thon before that hearing in October of 2018. And we had volunteers that came together to translate all of those stories into English so that when the judge said that to Ed again, we could say, we understand that you don't read Spanish. Here are all those stories with Emilio's bylines in English, so that because his doubt of Emilio as a journalist was being used as a major argument. And once we had that proof, and he couldn't use that anymore, then he switched to some other ridiculous claim that, well, maybe it's safer for him to go back now when CPJ and every other organization had in that year, Mexico was the most dangerous place in the world for journalists.
Including the Department of State. But anyway, we could go on for a long time. We've gone over our hour. I want to thank everybody who's here for being here, because many of you were part of this case. I think it's wonderful that for those of you who have an opportunity to come meet Emilio, for those of you who have questions, more questions for us, we'll be hanging around for a little bit. But I really hope that this is the beginning and not the end, because there are other journalists who really need our help.
So many other journalists.
Thanks very much for being here. Thank you. Bye. You brought a lot of people together, Emilio. I would say none of us none of us knew each other until